Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the north in the Russian Kharkiv offensive. The Russians north of the city in the direction of the town of Lipsy, which is an important Ukrainian stronghold in the northern direction. The Russians have advanced within the Dacha area to the north of the town, where they are slowly advancing towards it to reach the outskirts of it in a northern direction. To the northeast, the Russians have reached the town and fighting is happening on the outskirts of it near the Ukrainian fortifications in the area. Further east, the Russians have expanded their control of the Ukrainian territory south of Luhansk, where they are expanding in the direction of Vesele directly towards it, east towards Neskushne and towards Zelene, where the Russians first captured the majority of the village, after which the Ukrainians counterattacked and recaptured parts of it. So with this, we're seeing that the Russians are expanding mainly right now south of Luhansk towards Vesele, while there is a direct push towards Lipsy. The Russians are expanding in both of these directions in the northern section of the front line. In the eastern section, the Russians have not fully captured Zarizhzhia, but fighting continues on the western parts of it, where the Russians are attacking both from the west and from the east of the Ukrainian positions, pushing them out of it to push along the river line here to the south by the Donetsk River. To the east, in the direction of Avdiivka, heavy fighting continues, where we see this drone footage of heavy artillery fire in the southern parts of the town. The Russians are heavily bombarding it to prevent the Ukrainians from gathering large groups of soldiers to counterattack, and at the same time weakening the Ukrainian defensive positions for the future Russian assaults across the river line. The Russians are still only in their initial stage of the Kharkiv offensive, and we see that there is this footage here of a strike. This strike was reportedly against a Ukrainian ammunition depot in the southwest of Kharkiv, as it was geolocated too. It is also reported that there was an underground bunker which was struck here and nearby as well. So according to these reports, the Russians are hitting Ukrainian defensive positions and command posts southwest of Kharkiv in relation to this offensive operation. In the meantime, the Ukrainians are attempting to weaken the Russian Air Force by hitting the airfields in the north of Crimea Peninsula. We see this as satellite image prior to the strike, and then this next one after the strike, where we see both two planes and a command post hangar in the airfield was struck in this airstrike by the Ukrainians launching long-range missiles towards the north of Crimea. And with this, we see that the Russians have been hit in one of these airfields. How much of an effect does this have on the front? Not any significant effect. It has hit a couple of jets, which hurts the Russians and the Russian Air Force. However, the Russian Air Force have hundreds of jets, and the Ukrainians use approximately 10 to 20 missiles to hit these targets, while in total they do not have the necessary amounts to make a significant dent on the Russian Air Force, and this is one of the few that did succeed. If we only count the successful ones, then there is a ratio of about 20 missiles to one jet being destroyed, and that is not a good ratio for Ukrainians to properly hit the Russian Air Force in the rear. The Ukrainians do not nearly have enough missiles and jets themselves to effectively hit on a large scale the Russian airfields. We then move on here in the Kharkiv-Luhansk area, where the Russians have started an attack towards Berestove, attacking in the northern direction towards it, and with this the Russians are starting an assault in the direction of the village. It's likely that the Russians will push here to gain control of Berestove before pushing towards Peshane. The reason for this is that in the direction of Peshane there are high grounds to the north and to the south of the village. The Russians are currently not on the elevation northeast of it. This means that if the Russians want to gain control over Peshane, they have to push in northern direction towards the fortifications there, and in the southern direction towards the fortifications south of Peshane. So they are attacking Berestove first, which will also allow the Russians to secure Netailove from the north, and then push towards the fortifications south of Peshane through the heights from Berestove, after which they can start attacking the village itself and the fortifications to the north. This would allow the Russians to secure a significant portion west of Avdiivka, Berestove and Kuzimivka, where they will be able to launch offensive operations towards the Oskar River line. With the control over Kislivka and Kotlyarivka, the Russians can also push in a northern direction, and offensive operation towards Kupiansk could begin following the capture of Peshane, Ivanivka, and Stepova Novoselivka. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here west of Avdiivka, the Russians have managed to advance significantly within Netailove, capturing the majority of the village, leaving only a small part of the western outskirts remaining under Ukrainian control. This means that the Russians will now significantly strengthen their southern flank here west of Pervomaiske and launch offensive operations north towards Yasnobrodivka. It is likely that the Russians here will combine that with assaults from Umansk following the capture of that as well to attack Yasnobrodivka from multiple directions and flank the Ukrainian fortifications in the area. This will lead to the Russians controlling everywhere east of these two lakes and have a significant strong flank here to the west of Avdiivka. This will allow the Russians to focus much of their effort in a northern direction towards Novoselivka, Persha, Mesove, Novopokrovsk, and other villages here to the north, and to start a flanking maneuver south in direction of Nevelske, flanking the Ukrainian positions there, gain control over the fortifications, and gaining control over the northern parts of Krasnohorivka in these fields with hardly any Ukrainian positions available in the area. This is a significant development in favor of the Russians in this section of the front line, as there is no other significant Ukrainian positions in the area. Nevelske is a strong Ukrainian position, but following the Russian capture of the majority of the pocket here to the east of Nevelske, the Russians will be able to organize their forces into a push towards the village and recapture it. At the same time, with the capture of Netailove, they can flank the Ukrainian fortifications to the west of the village, allowing the Russians to gain a significant advantage in the area. We then move on to the south of Krasnohorivka in the direction of Heorhiivka, where the Russians have again managed to make a significant advance in this section of the front line, where they've managed to capture the majority of Heorhiivka, leaving only the western outskirts of the town remaining slightly under Ukrainian control. This is in close proximity to the town of Maximilianivka, so it's a different position than Netailove. However, the Russians with this would be able to gain full control over the lakes to the south of Krasnohorivka. A strong flank north of Heorhiivka will allow the Russians to flank the Ukrainian fortifications to the south of the town, west of Pobieda, to strengthen the Russian positions in the area and start pushing in a southern direction towards Konstantinivka in this section of the front line west of Novomikhailivka. At the same time, it also allowed the Russians to start pushing towards Maximilianivka, where it will allow the Russians to advance through the highway as well to the south of Heorhiivka to gain control over the heights in the area and push towards Maximilianivka both from the heights and directly towards it. This would allow the Russians to push towards the railways here west of Krasnohorivka and gain control over this supply line as well towards the city of Krasnohorivka. With this, we see that the Russians are developing the offensive operations here in the Donetsk region west of the city of Donetsk. The fact that the Russians are pushing both in the northern and southern flank of the west of Donetsk shows that they are developing the offensive operations in both of these directions. The next target of the Russians in these areas would be west of Heorhiivka towards Kharkiv, which has significant fortifications of the Ukrainian defenses. To the north by Krasnohorivka, capturing that city will allow the Russians to create a massive buffer zone here to the west of Donetsk city and start offensive operations towards the village chain in that area. To the north, it will allow the Russians to continue pushing northwest of Avdiivka towards the city of Pokrovsk, strengthening the flank here west of Avdiivka, and to continue offensive operations in a northwestern direction and in a northern direction towards Konstantinivka, and the highways aligned with that between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka and between Avdiivka and Konstantinivka. So this shows that the Russian offensive operations have multiple targets. To the south, Kharkiv, slightly north, Selidove, further north, Pokrovsk, in a northern direction to Konstantinivka, Donetsk, and New York. These are all of the important areas, and the center of all of this is this highway northwest of Ocheretine, which is the Russian main target. That is currently their number one priority, to push towards the highway, gain control of that. That will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations in every direction towards Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk. And with that, we see that the Russian offensive operations continue in the Donetsk region as well as in the Kharkiv region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.